The wedding of my daughter Amelia should have been the happiest day of my life. Yet as I stood at the edge of the ballroom, listening to the murmur of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the slow hum of a string quartet, I felt a strange distance growing between me and the world I had built for her. I wasn't dressed in a suit that screamed wealth or influence. Instead, I chose a modest gray one, slightly worn at the cuffs, with shoes polished just enough to avoid embarrassment. To everyone in that grand hall, I was simply Amelia's father, a man they hardly knew and had even less reason to care about. Nobody knew that I quietly owned 12 companies, spread across industries from construction to tech, that my investments silently paid for a significant portion of the city's skyline, or that I could, if I wished, have thrown a wedding 10 times larger without blinking at the expense. But that was precisely the point. I didn't want them to know. I wanted to see, in the most raw and unfiltered way, how people would treat me if they thought I was just a middle-class father trying to give his daughter the best day he could. My whole life, I had been surrounded by sycophants, business partners pretending to be friends, and acquaintances who smiled a little wider once they discovered the balance in my accounts. But tonight wasn't about the size of my bank account. Tonight was about Amelia, and a quiet test I had set up for myself. Would the people she had chosen to surround herself with, her new in-laws, her friends, her husband's family, would they treat me with kindness and respect, or would they brush me aside as though I didn't matter? As I walked to the reception hall's corner table, I noticed how some guests barely acknowledged me, their eyes darting past me toward those they deemed more important. The groom's uncle, in particular, offered me a limp handshake before turning to boast to another guest about his new golf membership. A group of Amelia's college friends smiled politely when I approached, but quickly shifted the conversation to their own plans and careers, leaving me standing there like an outsider at my own daughter's wedding. I forced myself to smile, but deep down, I was taking notes, not of their words, but of their character. Still, there were moments that pulled me back from my quiet observations. When Amelia walked in, radiant in her white gown, her eyes searching for mine, and I gave her a nod that meant more than words could express. My daughter didn't know about my companies either. Not yet. To her, I was just Dad, the man who'd taken her to school, stayed up late helping her with projects, and held her hand when she was scared of thunderstorms. And that's exactly who I wanted to be for her tonight. Yet, behind that role, I was also watching. I saw how the groom's younger cousin, a shy boy no older than 15, pulled out my chair for me at dinner when nobody else thought to. I saw how the elderly grandmother of the groom clasped my hand and said, "You must be so proud of Amelia," with genuine warmth in her eyes. And then, in stark contrast, I saw how the groom's parents barely gave me a moment's time, busying themselves with impressing the guests they thought mattered more. The champagne glasses shimmered under the chandeliers, the music swelled as the couple shared their first dance, and the whole room buzzed with celebration. But inside me, a different kind of story was unfolding. I was quietly separating those who valued people for who they were from those who valued only what they thought people could give them. And little did anyone know, the results of this silent experiment would determine far more than how I remembered this wedding. It would determine the future of who in this room I would trust, who I would share my secrets with, and maybe who I would change the lives of forever. Because one day soon, the truth would come out. And when it did, the ones who had dismissed me as insignificant would learn a lesson they'd never forget. The reception hall glittered with chandeliers, laughter, and clinking glasses, but behind every smile, I could sense the quiet calculations people made about who was worth talking to, who could open doors for them, who was someone in the room, and who wasn't. I sat at a table tucked near the edge of the hall, deliberately blending in, my black suit looking no different from the dozens of other middle-aged fathers there. My daughter, glowing in her white gown, twirled across the dance floor, her joy so pure it almost distracted me from the subtle cruelty unfolding around me. When I approached a group of my extended family, people I had quietly supported financially for years, I was met with forced smiles that faded the moment I mentioned nothing about business or wealth. "Oh, you're still working at that little office job, right?" one of them said with a tone so dismissive it stung. I nodded politely, knowing full well that little office job managed supply chains worth hundreds of millions. but I had vowed not to say a word, to let the evening reveal the truth about people, about who valued me for me, and who only cared for status. Later, at the buffet table, I noticed how quickly people flocked around the man who introduced himself as a regional bank manager. Suddenly, he was treated like royalty, glasses raised in his direction, while I stood just 2 feet away, ignored like a stranger. One woman, a distant cousin, actually pushed past me without so much as an apology, just to greet him. I smiled faintly, though deep down, a part of me felt the sting of years of sacrifice gone unnoticed. Hadn't I paid for her son's education? Hadn't I covered medical bills when her husband was sick? Yet now, I was invisible, simply because I hadn't announced what I owned. My daughter's in-laws weren't much different. They gave me cordial nods, polite but uninterested, as though I was a man to be tolerated rather than respected. Only my daughter, unaware of the test I was conducting, continued to beam at me with love, rushing to grab my hand and thank me for everything, her eyes soft with gratitude that needed no explanation. When the speeches began, I sat quietly as people praised others for accomplishments far smaller than mine, clapping while my name was hardly mentioned except as the father of the bride. It was humbling, yes, but also revealing. The truth was clear. Without the shield of my wealth, I was to them just another man in a worn suit. And strangely, that clarity was both painful and liberating. I realized that when the time came, when the night was over, the masks would fall, and those who had treated me with indifference would one day stand in shock when they learned the truth. But for now, I let the evening play out, silently recording every smile, every snub, every shallow word exchanged. I wasn't angry. I was learning, and every cold shoulder was a lesson that money doesn't buy loyalty. It only exposes the lack of it. The night grew long, the music softer, and as my daughter's new husband whispered something in her ear, I sat back, content in my silence. But in the back of my mind, a seed was growing. How many of these people who ignore me tonight would come running tomorrow when they discovered who I really was? And more importantly, would I forgive them? That was the question I carried as I raised my glass to my daughter, hiding the weight of a secret that could change everything. That if you're invested in this journey, in this test of love, loyalty, and truth, make sure to like this video, leave a comment about what you would do in my place, and don't forget to subscribe. The reception was now in full swing. Laughter floated across the grand ballroom. Champagne glasses clinked together, and couples swayed on the dance floor beneath a chandelier dripping with crystals. I stood near the corner of the room, the polished marble cool beneath my shoes, watching my daughter twirl in her wedding gown. For a moment, the joy in her face washed away my loneliness. She looked radiant, happy, everything a father would want for his daughter. But as I glanced around, I realized how invisible I had become. People didn't just overlook me, they dismissed me. A distant cousin brushed past me without so much as eye contact. One of the groomsmen, tall and loud, handed me an empty glass as if I were a waiter. I said nothing, just stared at it in my hand before quietly setting it aside. At the buffet table, I saw my old friend from college, Michael, who had once leaned on me for everything. He used to borrow money when he couldn't pay rent, and I always helped him without hesitation. Tonight, though, when I approached with a smile, his eyes darted past me toward a group of lawyers bragging about their new sports cars. He muttered a cold, "Excuse me," and walked away, leaving me mid-sentence. That sting cut deeper than I'd expected. It wasn't about the words. It was about how small he made me feel. Even my daughter's in-laws treated me with indifference. Her new mother-in-law, dressed in a glittering silver gown, laughed at my modest suit and whispered something to her husband. They both chuckled before turning their backs. I knew what they saw, a man who looked ordinary, maybe even struggling. They had no clue that the man they were mocking owned 12 thriving companies, businesses that stretched from real estate to technology. I could have bought their entire neighborhood if I wanted to, but that wasn't the point. The point was to see them for who they really were when the veil of wealth was gone. Later that evening, I sat quietly at a round table near the back of the hall. The conversations around me swirled with shallow compliments, name-dropping, and boasts of expensive vacations. No one invited me into their circle. My presence seemed to shrink into the shadows. But then I noticed one person, a young waiter, probably no older than 19, who paused to refill my glass of water. "Sir, are you enjoying yourself?" he asked sincerely, his eyes kind and without pretense. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, and his hands trembled from carrying trays, but his politeness struck me. In a room full of people desperate to impress, it was the staff, the so-called invisible ones, who treated me with dignity. I thought of my daughter again. Would she ever realize how many people were pretending? Would she understand that the same people showering her with compliments tonight were the ones judging me, her father, simply because I didn't flaunt wealth? A deep ache settled in my chest, but I reminded myself why I was enduring this charade. This was the test. My fortune wasn't the prize, it was the mirror. I needed to see who valued hearts over wallets, who respected character more than status. As the night stretched on, more moments of humiliation followed. A bridesmaid asked if I could fetch her another drink. One of the groom's uncles loudly asked where I worked, and then smirked when I hesitated to answer. "Must not be much," he said, laughter rippling around him. I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to reveal the truth. Because if I did, the test would end, and the mask would fall too quickly. But beneath all the rejection, one thought pushed me forward. When the time was right, when the world least expected it, the truth would surface. And then those who ignore me tonight would face the weight of their own reflection. Stay tuned, because what happens next will shock everyone in that ballroom, and maybe even you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The next morning after the wedding, as the sun spilled through the wide glass windows of my house, I sat alone at the breakfast table, replaying every conversation from the night before like a film I couldn't turn off. The laughter of those who mocked me, the dismissive glances from people I had once helped, the way some relatives had spoken to me as if I were invisible, all of it clung to me like smoke in the air. I poured myself a cup of coffee and thought of my daughter's radiant smile when she walked down the aisle. She deserved happiness untainted by the bitterness in my heart, and I promised myself I wouldn't let my anger overshadow her joy. Yet I couldn't deny the ache inside me. The wedding had revealed more than I wanted to know about human nature. My test had worked. People who thought I was an ordinary old man with nothing to offer had shown their true colors. Mocking, ignoring, even outright avoiding me unless they needed something. The ones who treated me with kindness without knowing my wealth, they stood out like rare gems. My daughter, Sarah, and her new husband, Daniel, had not wavered. Their love for me had been clear in every hug, every laugh, every dance. But as I thought of others, cousins who once begged me for help, friends who had grown rich off my generosity, colleagues who used to call me brother, I realized how fragile loyalty truly was when money wasn't involved. In my study, I pulled out an old leather-bound journal and began writing names in 2 columns. Those who had treated me with respect and those who had dismissed me. My hand trembled slightly with both anger and sadness as I drew the line between them. The weight of my pen on the paper felt like a gavel, a silent verdict of who would remain in my life and who would not. Later that day, as family gathered for a small post-wedding lunch, I stayed quiet and observant once more. My wealthy brother-in-law, Richard, who believed he was the most successful man in the family, ignored me completely and instead boasted loudly about his business deals. My cousin Emily, who had brushed past me at the wedding, now pretended I didn't exist as she chatted with others. But my niece, Lily, only 19 years old, came to sit with me. She asked if I was tired, if I needed water, and she listened as I spoke about how beautiful the wedding had been. She didn't care who had the biggest bank account. She cared that I was okay. And in that small, tender gesture, she earned a place in my heart forever. The test had started as a game of curiosity, but it was now becoming the most important decision-making tool of my life. Wealth had shielded me for years, but removing that shield revealed the raw truth. Respect should never be bought. It must be given freely. By the evening, I made a decision. Those who failed my quiet test would never know of my fortune, nor would they benefit from it. But those who passed, those rare souls who saw me as more than money, would one day inherit everything I had built. I closed my journal, locked it away, and smiled faintly, realizing that this secret had given me clarity I had never known before. The silence had spoken louder than any announcement of riches ever could. And though the world might see me as ordinary, I now saw myself as someone holding the ultimate power, the truth of who was genuine and who was not. My story was no longer just about a wedding. It was about unmasking the reality of love, family, and respect. And this was only the beginning. If you want to know how I finally revealed the truth, make sure to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this journey, the days after the wedding unfolded. I found myself in an unusual place of reflection, where every small gesture, every word spoken at the ceremony, replayed in my mind like an endless loop, dissecting which moments were genuine and which were wrapped in pretense. And though I had chosen to keep my 12 companies hidden, the weight of that secret felt heavier now. Not because I feared being exposed, but because it had unveiled something more raw. The true faces behind the polite masks, the friends who ignored me when they assumed I was just a modest, unimportant father, the relatives who brushed past me to hover around the wealthier guests, and the strangers who offered courtesy, only when it benefited them. Yet amidst that darkness, there were rare flickers of light that gave me strength, like when my daughter, radiant in her gown, clasped my hand during the father-daughter dance and whispered, "Dad, I don't care about what anyone else thinks of you. You've already given me the world by raising me the way you did." And in that moment, I realized she had unknowingly spoken the truth of my entire life's purpose. That no company, no amount of fortune, no $1,000,000 property could ever rival the wealth of love I saw in her eyes. Though outside that warmth, the bitterness of reality remained when I noticed cousins gossiping about the gifts, calculating worth as though the marriage was some financial deal. Or when a so-called friend only began inviting me to business dinners once rumors of my hidden empire started circulating after someone accidentally let slip that I was wealthier than anyone could imagine, and I sat in silence, watching these shifting tides of behavior, both hurt and oddly relieved, because their reactions only validated the reason I had chosen this test in the first place. But the most painful blow came when I overheard my own brother, whom I had once supported financially through years of struggle, laughing with others, saying, "Well, he's just the quiet type, never did anything big with his life." Not knowing that I had quietly paid for his children's education, bought the house he lived in, and covered debts he could never repay. And though the sting of betrayal cut deep, I swallowed the ache and stayed still, for this was the truth I had wanted to see, the unvarnished reality of who would honor me for who I am, not what I own. Yet through that pain came clarity, a kind of rebirth in my soul. Because if love could survive in my daughter's gratitude, if kindness could exist in the waiter at the reception who treated me with dignity without knowing my name, then perhaps there was still hope in a world where wealth blinds and shadows the heart. And that hope became the anchor that carried me through the long night when I finally returned home, loosened my tie, and sat alone with nothing but silence in my thoughts, whispering to myself that I would not reveal my truth just yet, not until I was certain who deserved to know, because wealth was a dangerous weapon in the wrong eyes, but a gift when placed in the hands of the loyal and the humble. And so I resolved that my 12 companies, my fortune, my empire, built from years of sleepless nights and sacrifices, would not be flaunted to win admiration, but guarded, only revealed when a moment proved someone's respect came from the soul, not the pocket. And as I closed my eyes, I knew the story wasn't over. This secret, my shield and my test, would continue to unfold, but for now, I had one certainty that no betrayal could tarnish. I was proud of the woman my daughter had become, proud that she could step into a new life with values far stronger than money. And in that pride I found peace, whispering to myself, respect is priceless, and not everyone can afford it. Friends, if you followed my journey this far, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because the truth I'm about to reveal in the next part might change everything. As the night wore on, the wedding hall glowed with warmth. Golden fairy lights swayed in the breeze. The clinking of glasses mixed with soft laughter, and music drifted in the background like a gentle reminder of celebration. Yet for me, Sophia, the mother who had sat silently among the crowd. This was the moment everything would change. For hours, I had been nothing but a quiet observer, watching as relatives paraded their wealth, neighbors flaunted their status, and so-called friends ignored me completely, dismissing me as just another woman in a plain blue gown, too ordinary to matter. I had seen who rushed to shake the hands of the flashy uncle who boasted about his imported car, who hung on to the every word of the cousin who bragged about his Dubai investments, and who gave me nothing more than a polite nod before turning away, thinking I had nothing worth offering. Yet amid the sea of arrogance and shallow charm, I had also noticed the rare few who treated me with respect. Like little Maria, a childhood friend of my daughter who complimented my dress and sat beside me when she thought I looked lonely, and like Father Daniel, an old family friend who told me, "Sophia, wealth isn't in the wallet, it's in the heart." These gestures struck me deeper than gold ever could. But tonight wasn't just about silently taking notes. Tonight was about finally revealing who I really was. So, when the host called me to the stage for the traditional blessing of the bride and groom, I took the microphone, my hands steady, my voice calm, my heart carrying the weight of decades of silence. "Good evening," I began, looking at the hundreds of faces, most of them expectant but not particularly interested. "I stand here as Sophia, the mother of the bride. Many of you know me as just that, an ordinary woman. Some of you didn't even notice me tonight. Some ignored me entirely." I paused, letting the silence stretch across the hall. The hum of chatter ceased. All eyes locked on me. But I have carried a secret. For over 20 years, I have quietly built something none of you could imagine. I'm not just Sophia. I am the founder and owner of 12 companies. I have invested, I have grown, and I have built an empire that spans countries. And tonight I realized most of you had no idea because I never told you. Gasps erupted in the room. The same relatives who hadn't given me a second glance were now frozen, their mouths half open. The arrogant uncle clutched his chair, blinking in disbelief. The cousins leaned forward, eyes wide. Suddenly, people were straining to see me, to hear every word. I lifted my chin, my voice sharper now. I stayed quiet not because I wanted applause, but because I wanted to see who among you would treat me with dignity, even when you thought I had nothing. And now I know. A murmur rippled across the crowd, embarrassment painted on their faces. My daughter, in her ivory gown, covered her mouth in shock, tears pooling in her eyes. She knew I worked hard, but she never knew the depth of my success. My son-in-law looked at me with newfound admiration, as though he had underestimated the very woman who had raised his wife. I continued, my voice breaking slightly. Success means nothing if respect depends on wealth. Tonight, I saw who valued me for me. And to those who looked down on me, let me say this. Your judgment reveals more about you than it ever did about me. Applause erupted from a small cluster. The true ones, the genuine few who had been kind to me without knowing my status. But others sat in shame, faces lowered, unable to meet my eyes. For once, it wasn't me who felt invisible. It was them. I looked at my daughter, her hands trembling as she held mine, whispering, "Mama, you're incredible." And in that moment, I knew that this night was not about revenge or pride. It was about legacy. I wanted her to see that her worth was never in jewels, never in designer gowns, but in strength, perseverance, and self-respect. So I ended with a smile, my voice carrying through the hall. Remember, never judge a book by its cover, for the story inside might just change everything you thought you knew. The lights seemed to shine brighter, the music swelled again, and my daughter embraced me, sobbing softly against my shoulder. Around us, the hall buzzed with whispers, stunned faces, and awkward silence from those who had been exposed by my experiment. I had revealed the truth, and now it would echo in every conversation long after the wedding night ended. And as I walked off the stage, I felt lighter than I had in years, because respect, once proven, is worth far more than millions. Friends, if you believe respect should never depend on money, then please don't forget to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters in life.